In this last part of today's class, we're going to look at the Holocaust through a legal lens. Think about how the period between 1933 and 1945 could be looked at as a series of legal events that gradually changed the status of Jews from citizens to non-citizens to something less than human and not worthy of life. We'll look briefly at the stark contrast between the legal system in the Weimar Republic and then what transpired under the Third Reich. And then we'll look at the four stages of the war against Jews, which can be classified and divided into identification and definition, expropriation and emigration, concentration and ghettoization, and finally extermination and annihilation. The pre-World War II Weimar Republic was a fractious, multi-party parliamentary democracy in Germany between 1919 and 1933. Its laws and jurisprudence were looked upon as inspiration prior to World War II in many other jurisdictions because the Weimar Republic was characterized by independent judges. It was a law-based state. There was a constitution that protected individual rights. However, one of the key features was legal positivism, which, as we've discussed, are rules that are passed and kind of backed up by threat or sanction or threat of force by the government. And this becomes important when the Nazis come to power because they sort of co-opt this favoritism towards legal positivism, and they make sure that their persecution of Jews, of other undesirable groups, of the Roma, of disabled individuals are based on legal decrees. And without the legal decree, they don't believe there is this legal cover to persecute. And, an example that sort of demonstrates this is when Hermann Goering suggested that German travelers can always kick off Jewish passengers in a crowded train. And the propaganda minister, Joseph Goebbels, says, well, I would not say that. I don't believe this. There has to be a law. So there was this notion, unless there's a law, you can't persecute anybody. You can persecute people pursuant to a law. Now, going back to the sort of fractious nature of the Weimar Republic, the National Socialist German Workers' Party, also known as the Nazi Party, was one of the many political parties in this fractious Weimar Republic. And the party blamed Jews inside and outside of Germany for the country's defeat in World War II. In 1933, the Weimar Republic came to a crashing conclusion and was replaced by the Third Reich. On January 30th, 1933, Hitler, as the leader of the Nazi Party, became Chancellor of the Weimar Republic after his party had won the most seats in a November 1932 parliamentary election. The goal for 1933 for the Nazi Party was to eliminate its opposition, and it was done through a number of legal measures. The first step toward establishing a single-party dictatorship was the Reichstag Fire Decree. The Reichstag Fire occurred in February 1933, leading to the Reichstag Fire Decree under Article 48 of the Weimar Constitution, which allowed the president to rule by emergency decrees under certain circumstances without prior consent of parliament. The next step in establishing a single-party dictatorship was the Enabling Act in March 1933. This was the law for removing the distress of the people and the Reich. A seemingly innocuously named law actually gave Hitler the authority to rule by decree for 4 years. And so with this, we have reversion to a dictatorial regime instead of a parliamentary government. In July of the same year, the law against the formation of parties was passed, so no longer could any new political parties opposing the Nazi Party be formed. And all the while, Dachau had been opened and political opponents were being stuffed inside. In 1934, President von Hindenburg died, and Hitler combined the roles of president and chancellor in himself, meaning that all laws, including the Constitution, became subsumed under the so-called Führer principle. Law was replaced by decisions of Hitler. And at the end of the Weimar Republic and the beginning of the Third Reich, we divide the 12-year Third Reich period into two smaller periods. We have 1933 to 1939, which is noted by Hitler's consolidation of power in Germany, the annexation of Austria and takeover of part of Czechoslovakia. And then 1939 to 45 is characterized by the German invasion of Poland, UK and France declare war on Germany, and World War II begins. Stage 1 of the war against Jews, identification and definition. Persecution of Jews began with anti-Jewish laws passed the National Socialist era, and the laws were gradually used to change the status of Jews. The laws were big and they were small. For example, the 1933 law for the reestablishment of the professional civil service banned Jews from the civil service. A 1933 Baden State decree banned Yiddish in cattle markets, and there was even a law banning Jewish use of Aryan hairdressers. No matter was too small to legislate. In 1935, the so-called Nuremberg laws were passed. They were two laws: the Reich Citizenship Law, which deprived Jews of citizenship, and then the Law for the Protection of German Blood and Honor, which forbid marriage and extramarital sexual intercourse between Jews and citizens of German or kindred blood. The Nazis had defined Jews by genealogy and not religion, which means you didn't have to practice Judaism to be considered a Jew. And so the Nazis then had to make up more laws to define who was a Jew. Stage 2 of the war against Jews was characterized by legal and extra-legal expropriation of property and emigration between 1935 and 1939. For example, in 1937, as coercion to emigrate, persons were promised to be freed from Dachau if they left the country. In November 1939, in response to Kristallnacht, a night 1,000 synagogues were burned and over 7,500 shops looted, the government issued a decree fining the German Jewish community 1 billion Reichsmarks, and issued another decree ordering German insurance companies to pay the state and not Jewish owners for their losses. Historian Peter Hayes, in a discussion aptly titled "Learning How to Steal Germany Between 1933 and 1939, aptly summarizes the state-sponsored robbery in his book, The Oxford Handbook of Holocaust Studies, and I wish to share just a few short passages with you so that we all may get a better visual sense of what the level of stealing was like during this period. By the end of 1937, 60% of the roughly 100,000 Jewish-owned businesses in Germany as of 1933 had been liquidated or Aryanized. The total wealth of German Jews had fallen by 40 to 50%. 1/3 of the German Jewish population had fled the country, and nearly all of the Jews remaining were working for themselves or each other or unemployed and dependent on the community's relief measures. Kristallnacht accelerated the robbery. Following the Kristallnacht pogrom of November 1938, this system of dispossession was extended to the entire Reich and expanded in a variety of ways. All German Jews had to establish blocked accounts. The Aryanization of all Jewish-owned businesses became compulsory at terms set by politically appointed trustees, and a fine of 1 billion Reichsmarks was imposed on the Jewish population. Each person who had registered his or her property in the summer of 1938 now had to pay 25% of its total value in installments to the National Treasury by August 1939. Doing so became doubly difficult when the regime ordered Jews to put their stocks and bonds in safe deposit accounts from which sales could take place only with government permission, and forced Jews to surrender virtually all their possessions containing precious metals to the state-run pawn shops in return for nominal compensation paid to blocked accounts. Such restrictions compelled Jews to convert as many of their other assets as possible to cash, often by selling their furniture, artworks, and household goods, and by redeeming their insurance policies for their paid-in value, which went directly to the blocked accounts. On the eve of World War II, the robbery was complete. By the summer of 1939, the Third Reich had reduced German Jews to penury and pocketed at least 3 billion of the 7.1 billion Reichsmarks in property that they had registered the previous year. In the succeeding years, the regime may have raked in as much as half of the remainder through additional impositions, the mandatory conversion of sums in blocked accounts into war bonds, and the terms of the 11th decree to the Reich citizenship law, which declared that the property of German Jews, quote, fell to the state as of the moment they exited the country, whether through emigration or deportation. Stage 3 of the war against Jews was characterized by concentration and ghettoization between 1939 and 1941. In September 1939, war broke out, and as Hitler invaded Poland, France, Belgium, the Netherlands, Norway, Denmark, Greece, the Reich's Ministry of Justice was recruited to develop laws to apply to these territories formally and informally incorporated into the Third Reich. Multiple types of laws were required for conquered and occupied regions. There was governing law for areas annexed directly into the German state, such as Austria. German law applied. For areas under direct German occupation and direct administration, such as the general government of Poland, occupation law applied. As an occupier, Germany could make new rules and laws in Germany to be applied in Poland, and that was technically in conformance with the international law on occupation. Finally, for puppet regimes such as Vichy France, laws were passed by those new regimes in France, but they were heavily influenced by Germany. There were also laws applying to resistors. In 1941, the Night and Fog Decree was passed. The laws were used to deal with resistance of local populations and authorized extraordinary measures in all occupied territories. Political suspects were disappeared. Summary court proceedings preceded either killings or imprisonments, and the laws were justified as being necessary to protect German troops from terrorist acts. There were also so-called atonement measures, collective punishment for attacks on Germans or German property, and that meant that innocent people from communities where crimes were committed were shot. Finally, there were laws for concentration into ghettos. By decree, Jews were concentrated into ghettos on grounds and reasoning such as health and safety. And then Jewish councils were forced to transmit German directives to the Jewish population, and Jewish police were used to enforce Germany's discriminatory laws. Now, Raphael Lemkin's 1944 Axis in Occupied Europe book compiled a list of these laws that were being used across Europe to persecute populations. His study showed that Nazi laws had turned European jurisprudence on its head. The laws did the opposite of protecting the population. The laws were persecuting them. The fourth stage of the war against Jews was characterized by extermination and annihilation between 1941 and 1945. There was a state-sponsored plan to murder all Jews between that time period under the cover of legality, and it began with Germany's invasion of the Soviet Union in 1941. In May of that year, Barbarossa Jurisdiction Order and Commissar Order was issued, and it provided legal cover for partisan killings by German troops. The order suspended courts-martial for civilians suspected of sabotage or guerrilla warfare and allowed and encouraged the summary killing of these individuals. Conveniently, no definition for commissar in the order was provided, so by law, Jews posing no resistance to fighting military became subject of fair game mass shooting. In September of that same year, the hostage reprisal order was issued, and it called for the killing of 50 to 100 undefined communists for every German life lost to insurrection in occupied territories. Now, we have to dispel the notion that only uneducated people were partaking in this mass killing. In fact, it was quite the opposite. Einsatzgruppe and the Special Action Murder Squads rounded up Jews and other targeted groups, Roma, political dissidents, disabled persons, Jehovah's Witnesses, and murdered them by firing squad and mobile gas killing vans to the order of 1.4 million individuals. Tellingly, the majority of Einsatzgruppen generals that went on trial at Nuremberg after the war were not uneducated individuals, they were lawyers. Directives were also passed promising death to anyone who assisted Jews during this time period. For example, In 1942, there was a Warsaw Directive promising capital punishment to both Jews found to have left the ghetto and the persons harboring them. The policy of extermination originated in Germany and was implemented through secret orders beginning in 1941. Reichsmarshal Hermann Goering issued a secret directive to Reinhard Heydrich, head of the Reich Security Office, stating, "I hereby charge you with making all necessary preparation in regard to organizational and financial matters for bringing about the total solution of the Jewish question in the German sphere of influence in Europe. Where other governmental agencies are involved, these are to cooperate with you. I charge you furthermore to send me, before long, an overall plan concentrating the organizational, factual, and material measures necessary for the accomplishment of the desired solution to the Jewish question." This directive was put into state policy at the Wannsee Conference in January 1942, where participants were informed of a plan to murder the 11 million Jews of Europe. Of the 15 participants at this conference, 7 had law degrees. Unlike the raft of previously passed legislation and laws that stripped Jews of their civil rights, the extermination policy was never published in a formal law gazette. Secrecy was meant to lull victims into believing they were being resettled to the east, and the killings continued even when the tide of war had turned on Germany. Yet at the end of this first class, I leave you with the following. At the very end of the war, the justification made for the extermination was that it was legal. Was the extermination program legal? Konrad Morgen was an SS judge given the mandate to prosecute crimes by SS personnel in concentration camps, and he dedicatedly pursued corruption and unauthorized killings at the camps. But when it came to mass extermination at Auschwitz, he said he was powerless. He said, quote, "I saw that those killings, by being ordered, were legal in the sense of National Socialist law, and therefore I could not take any direct action on this sector."